You're not like your sister. You're not. You're better than she is. You're a good man and you can't save her. You don't need to die with her. Stay here. Stay with me. Please.
She's hateful. And so am I.
Hello Macabros, and welcome to episode 12 of Game of Thrones Rewrite. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, consider supporting the channel on Patreon, and sit back and relax as we trace the path of pretty much the most consistently badass and honorable character of the series, who doesn't get iced at some point, Brienne of Tarth. This episode won't be all that much of an individual rewrite for Brienne, but will serve more to fit Brienne's show arc in with the numerous changes we've made thus far. While Brienne remains pretty consistent throughout the run of the show, and the writers don't do anything too drastic that is completely disrespectful to the character, that is until the third to last episode, the writers, due to their decision to omit a certain decrepit character, whose role in the overall narrative we discussed in Arya's video, basically didn't have anything substantial for her to do following the end of Season 4, and thus, she mostly just, chills? Season 5, she's literally just sitting around while Sansa's at Winterfell, and doesn't do anything of note until she acts as Stannis in a rather contrived plot turn, in order to wrap that story thread up. In Season 6, after she brings Sansa to Castle Black, she sort of just vegges until she's sent by Sansa to the river run to meet with the Blackfish, for no real reason. It's not just that the Blackfish isn't able to help Sansa and Jon retake Winterfell due to his lackluster forces, it's how would that even have worked? The Blackfish surrenders River Run and then just hits up Jaime and is like, you can have it, dog. Gonna take my bros and go join up with my niece and help her to retake Winterfell. No. I know in the show Roose marrying Ramsay to Sansa was technically a slap in the face to the Lannisters, but there is no way that they would do anything that could potentially aid in them losing control over the North, even if it meant begrudgingly letting Roose off with a slap on the wrist. Even if Jaime wanted to help Sansa and Brienne, he couldn't just let the Blackfish and all his River Run men march to Castle Black, which is what he tells Brienne he would do, without his men being what the fuck? Anyway, Brienne goes to get the Blackfish's help, isn't able to get it, so her and Pod just fuck off back to Castle Black. Literally pointless. Brienne doesn't even get to kick some ass in the Battle of the Bastards. Same deal in Season 7 where she's just straight chillin'. There's no real main plot thread that she's ever actively engaged in. She gets sent to parlay with Cersei to act as Sansa's surrogate, only to get sent right back to Winterfell at the beginning of Season 8. There are some golden moments, don't get me wrong, but Brienne really doesn't go through any sort of substantial development. However, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Brienne's whole character is anchored by her honorable nature. And what makes her such a badass is her retaining that honor in a world that is in no way forgiving of or sentimental to it. While both the books and show showcase an array of wildly different characters who go through, in some cases, incredibly drastic personality changes, it can be just as rewarding to have characters who remain consistent throughout the narrative, with them serving as sort of a baseline for the audience to use to gauge the changes that other characters go through. Davos is another good example of how this archetype can work well. I guess they could have given Brienne an arc where she teeters on letting the unjust nature of the world and the treatment she has been subjected to due to her gender allow her to become more of a darker character. But yes, even for a miserable piece of shit such as myself, having a character who remains someone the audience can unabashedly root for without giving too much thought to the deeper moral implications of their actions can be nice. Brienne not changing all that much throughout the series isn't as big of a deal as the fact that following Season 4, she basically has nothing of note to do, and the reason for this is due to a major revision from the events of the books. In order to give this some more context, let's talk about Brienne's book path versus her show path. But first, let's get out of the way one of the more minor differences between book and show Brienne, and that is her looks. Brienne in the books is described as being far less conventionally attractive and feminine as she is portrayed in the show, which is part of the reason she leaned towards a more conventionally masculine life path with her aspirations to become a knight. So in the books, when it's stated that Brienne is called hideous and ugly, and this is why she was never seen as the object of affection to pretty much any man in her life, it makes sense. Whereas in the show, but this is completely understandable. Finding an actress who fit the right physical description of Brienne was probably difficult given Brienne's height, and needing that actress to actually have decent acting ability probably narrows that already small pool considerably. Which is why the casting of Gwendolyn Christie was a borderline miracle, given how well she fucking nailed the character and left such an impact on the fandom. And just in case you haven't seen this wholesome as fuck clip from the 2019 Emmys, allow me to share.
Their characters become part of our lives, and they're
Okay, so now let's discuss Brienne's arc. Brienne's show arc is pretty much identical to her book arc up until the end of Season 4. There are some changes here and there. We went over her and Jaime's interaction with the Brave Companions in Jaime's video and how they were replaced with Locke and his men, but it doesn't really change anything that drastic. Brienne and Jaime arrive at King's Landing after Joffrey's death, as opposed to before. Podrick is given to Brienne as a squire by Jaime in the show, whereas in the book, he follows Brienne himself after he learns she is searching for Sansa, hoping that this will lead him to Tyrion. Brienne and Podrick's travel route is obviously quite different. They never go to the Quiet Isle, they never run into Randall Tarley. This is mainly due to the fact that since the timelines of characters get shifted around, things just can't possibly play out as they do in the book. Again, not a huge deal and doesn't alter all that much. That is until Brienne and Podrick make it to the inn at the crossroads. In the show, Brienne and Podrick stop by the inn, which is where they run into Hot Pie, who tells them that Arya was seen in the company of the Hound, and Pod suggests they go to the Eyrie to see if the Hound is going to ransom Arya to her Aunt Lysa. And later, on their way to the Bloody Gate, they happen across Arya and Sandor, whom were turned away from the Eyrie after being informed of Lysa's suicide. But in a feast for crows, Brienne and Pod stop by the inn on their way to the Riverlands after hearing that Sandor Clegane was seen traveling with a girl, whom they think is Sansa, but is actually Arya. While at the inn, they do not meet Hot Pie, but instead run into Rourke, one of the Brave Companions who had threatened to rape Brienne after her and Jaime were captured in a storm of swords. Rourke has been pretending to be Sandor by wearing the helm of the Hound, which he just so happened to come across. Remember, at this point in the books, Sandor was already left for dead by Arya. Brienne is able to take her revenge by killing Rourke, but has part of her cheek bitten off by the aptly named Biter of the Brave Companions. She is then saved by Gendry, who just so happens to be working at the inn as a blacksmith. Delirious from infection, Brienne, along with Podrick, is taken prisoner by the Brotherhood without banners to that certain decrepit character I spoke of. You know, I don't know why I keep this spoiler warning on when I've thrown so many into the wind. The decrepit character is Lady Stoneheart, the reanimated corpse of Catelyn Stark, who was resurrected following the Red Wedding by Beric Dondarrion, who used his remaining life force to bring her back as a borderline zombie thirsty for vengeance, and she is now traveling with the Brotherhood in the Riverlands, picking off frays like the Granny Smith apples, and she's a northeastern white girl. Anyway, Brienne and Podrick are brought to Lady Stoneheart, and Brienne, in order to prove her loyalty, is commanded to kill Jaime Lannister because, and this is a small change, but is very important in the books, when Roose Bolton shanks Robb at the Red Wedding, in the show he says,
The Lannisters send their regards.
but in the book, he says Jaime Lannister sends his regards, which is a callback to something Jaime says earlier in A Storm of Swords. Another reason I love Roose. He pulls off the ballsiest betrayal of the series and still keeps his word. What a baller. This gives Stoneheart the impression that Jaime had a hand in the Red Wedding, which of course he did not. Brienne refuses to kill Jaime, and thus Stoneheart sentences Brienne and Podrick to hang. But just before their executions are to be carried out, Brienne screams out a word and the chapter ends. Though not confirmed, it is implied Brienne, in order to save Podrick from death, agrees to fetch and kill Jaime. This is later seemingly confirmed at the end of A Dance with Dragons, where, following Jaime settling the siege of Riverrun, Brienne comes to him and says that he must come with her, or Sandor Clegane will kill Sansa Stark. This is obviously a lie, and it is implied that Brienne is in fact bringing Jaime to Lady Stoneheart. As to why or what Brienne is planning, or how this wacky pair will talk their way out of this one, well, that has yet to be seen. So as you can see, Brienne is going to have a lot to do in the upcoming The Winds of Winter, with her, Jaime, and Lady Stoneheart colliding in a big do-or-die way that is probably going to result in the fates of these major players being affected drastically. But because Lady Stoneheart was omitted from the narrative, well, Brienne doesn't have anything to do after Season 4, which would have been right around the time Brienne would have probably come across Lady Stoneheart. And it's pretty obvious, even if you haven't read the books, how big Brienne, Jaime, and Lady Stoneheart colliding in this way truly is, especially for Brienne. Just think about all the different factors and dynamics at play. Brienne's relationship with Catelyn, her relationship with Jaime. Will Brienne still follow Catelyn's commands even though she is no longer really herself? Or will it be her developing love for Jaime that prevents her from following through with a duty she feels she must comply with? As for why Lady Stoneheart was removed from the show, Alex Graves, the director of the Season 4 finale, which is where most book readers expected to see her be introduced, stated, "But to bring back Michelle Fairley, one of the greatest actresses around, to be a zombie for a little while and just kill people, it's really sort of what are we doing with that? How does it play into the whole story in a way that we're really going to like? And yes, we are talking about the same Alex Graves who made those shitty comments regarding the rape scene. Oh, I'm sorry. Eventually consensual sex scene between Jaime and Cersei in Season 4, Episode 3, another episode that he directed. I know I've bitched about this quote before, but I honestly find it immeasurably baffling. Just the concept of Catelyn Stark being resurrected as a revenge-fueled zombie-esque character is completely in line with one of the most thematically prevalent motives throughout the series, which, simply put, is a life driven by revenge will only lead you to ruin, a theme we see play out throughout the arcs of multiple characters. Beyond that, the characters of Catelyn, Jaime, and Brienne are linked in a major way, given their climactic standoff at the end of A Clash of Kings. And now we're going to see these three characters interact once again, but under wildly different circumstances. And I am most excited to see how Brienne is going to come out of this impending meeting, and how her dynamics with both characters will dictate her actions. That is how it plays into the whole story in a way that I'm really going to like. Anyway, let's get back on track. So without Lady Stoneheart, the writers had to find shit for Brienne to do, even if it was pretty underwhelming overall. Now, I don't really feel like this warrants a full-on rehaul of Brienne's actions throughout the second half of the season, but while we discuss the changes we are going to have to make Brienne's character path match up with the numerous changes we've already made to the narrative at this point in our rewrite series, let's see if we can add in some kick-ass shit for Brienne to do in order to spice up her story a little bit. So at the beginning of Season 5, Brienne and Podrick, after not being able to find Arya after she runs off after Brienne's clash with the Hound, decide to head for Castle Black to see if Sansa may have met up with her half-brother Jon Snow. On their way, they stop at an inn where they happen to run into Sansa with Littlefinger. Quick aside, this part always bugged me. So Brienne and Podrick were on the road to the Eyrie. They lose Arya and decide to head for Castle Black. They stop at an inn. Now, based on Podrick's line where he says,
"Must be good food if it's crowded,"
I am led to believe that this is not the inn at the crossroads, since why would Pod say this if they had already been to this inn? I presume Brienne and Podrick retraced their steps and followed the road to the Eyrie back to the King's Road, as it would be the easiest way to travel north. But Littlefinger and Sansa also would have taken the road from the Eyrie to the King's Road in order to head north. So, where is this inn that they happen to run into each other at? I assume somewhere on the King's Road, and I guess Podrick and Brienne most likely would have avoided the main road for their safety, but how did they miss the party that is bringing Sansa to Winterfell? It's not a big deal, but it kind of bugged me a little bit. But in our rewrite, it doesn't matter, since Sansa doesn't head to Winterfell with Littlefinger at the beginning of Season 5. In our rewrite, she hangs at the Eyrie until the end of Season 5 and heads to Castle Black herself. I'm going to take a quick aside here just to clear up a few things from Sansa's video in regards to how people get from A to B. As for how Sansa gets from the Eyrie to Castle Black in our rewrite, obviously traveling on her own would be insurmountable. I mean, I guess she could, but the odds of her making it would be slim to none. However, perhaps she sails from the Eyrie to Eastwatch by the sea and makes her way to Castle Black from there. As for how they could have facilitated this, perhaps there was a ship that was transporting Night's Watch recruits from one of the ports of the Vale, perhaps Gulltown. Sansa could stow herself away on one of these ships, which gets her to Eastwatch, and when she arrives and reveals her identity as Sansa Stark to the Night Watch recruiter, he then brings her to Jon at Castle Black. And then later, as for how Sansa gets back to the Eyrie, she could just get an escort from Castle Black back to Eastwatch and have her take a ship back to the Eyrie while Jon prepares his forces for the Battle of the Bastards. And then, after Sansa returns and reveals her true identity to the Lords of the Vale and rouses them to help them take down the Boltons at Winterfell, Sansa can take them from the Vale and sail to White Harbor. And which house rules over White Harbor? The Manderleys, whom, if you recall last episode, we discussed are led by Lord Wyman Manderley, a staunch Stark loyalist and, at least in the books, the theorized leader of the Grand Northern Conspiracy. So of course, if Sansa rolled up to White Harbor with the Knights of the Vale, who were game for taking out the Boltons,
"You son of a bitch! I mean..."
The reason I bring this little tidbit up is that one of the more gleaned over plot points of Season 6, and by gleaned over I mean never really explained, is how Littlefinger led the Lords of the Vale to Winterfell when doing so would mean they would have to get through Moat Cailin. Most theories online chalk it up to the Lords of the Vale just plowing through it on their way to Winterfell, which is fine, I guess, whatever. But I like the sailing to White Harbor idea better. Plus, it gives a nod to Manderley being the baller that he is, instead of some wimpy fat fuck who gets pwned by a 4-year-old. Anyway, back to Brienne. So our rewrite will have Brienne and Podrick travel north on the King's Road on their way to Castle Black. They bypass Moat Cailin and arrive at Winterfell. Now, as we have discussed, we are basically replacing Sansa with Rickon being the one who was brought to Winterfell in an effort to use him to win over the Lords of the North, and is the one whom Theon eventually rescues from the castle. However, since Rickon was last at Last Hearth and is being brought to Winterfell by the Umbers, well, Last Hearth is way up here, so they are traveling south to Winterfell, so there is no way they could possibly run into each other like they do with Sansa. Easy fix. Either Brienne and Podrick pass Winterfell on their way to Castle Black, and on their way they run into the Umbers transporting Rickon to Winterfell. Perhaps they hide off to the side of the road while the Umbers pass, and they overhear an Umber troop call him Stark or something, and Brienne and Podrick put 2 and 2 together. Another option could be that the Umbers arrive at Winterfell with Rickon during episode 2 or 3, and Brienne and Podrick stop by the inn just outside of Winterfell after this and hear word that Rickon is alive and is in Winterfell. At this point, the Boltons would most likely just reveal that Rickon is alive, so they can use him to try and influence the houses of the north. There is no real reason for Roose to lie and keep up the story that Rickon and Bran are dead. As soon as Rickon arrives at Winterfell, Roose has word spread as he plans to have Ramsay manipulate and brainwash Rickon into doing their bidding, theorizing that having a Stark in Winterfell will placate the Northern Lords a bit more. Upon learning that Rickon is alive, Brienne and Podrick obviously change their plans and instead decide to stay near Winterfell and rescue Rickon so they can bring him to Castle Black with them. While Brienne's pledge to Catelyn and Jaime was to protect Sansa and Arya, this was obviously when Catelyn thought that Rickon was dead. So now that Rickon is learned to be alive, I could see Brienne deciding to stay and make sure he is safe. Also considering that if Sansa is at Castle Black per their theory, she is safe with Jon being there. Like in the show, our rewrite will see Brienne and Podrick passing a message to Rickon via the maid. Brienne and Pod, like in the show, will most likely be hanging out outside of Winterfell, waiting for Rickon's signal. Meanwhile, in the castle, per our episode on Theon, Rickon is desperately trying to bring Theon out of his psychosis. Season 5 will end as it does in the show, with Rickon, using the battle in the ice as cover, escaping from his tower. He is confronted by either Miranda or Bolton men who plan to bring him back to his cell. I say either Miranda or Bolton men since the dynamic between Miranda and Rickon wouldn't be the same between her and Sansa, so it may not work as well in our rewrite. But Theon, finally breaking from his psychosis, defends Rickon and helps him escape, both of them jumping off the wall of Winterfell into the snow below. Now in the show, Brienne and Podrick end up leaving their position outside of Winterfell after Pod sees that Stannis' forces have arrived for battle. This always kind of bugged me. I know Brienne wants her revenge on Stannis, but I can't see her just abandoning her mission to save Sansa to go after him. Seems sort of out of character to me. Now, as our rewrite scenario plays out pretty much the same as it does in the show, with Brienne and Podrick waiting around most of the season, I want to add in a way to make Brienne a bit more proactive, and therefore our rewrite will see, rather than Brienne and Podrick running off to find Stannis on the eve of the battle in the ice, they instead make their way to Winterfell to save Rickon themselves. I'd argue that upon learning that Stannis is marching on Winterfell, Brienne would surmise that if Stannis wins the battle in the ice, that Rickon is in grave danger. Now, of course, per our rewrite for Stannis, Stannis knows he will lose the battle on the ice and sends the majority of his men back to Castle Black and stays with a portion of his forces to hold off the Boltons long enough so the others can make their escape. But of course, Brienne would have no way of knowing this. If Stannis rolls up on Winterfell and the Boltons feel like Stannis may take the castle, the Boltons would probably just ice Rickon. So in Brienne's mind, the best course of action would be to use the chaos from the battle on the ice to charge into Winterfell and see if she can rescue Rickon herself, which is exactly what they do. Upon the arrival of Stannis' forces, Brienne and Podrick make their way into the belly of the beast in an attempt to save Rickon. We cut back to Rickon and Theon, who have just taken their jump off the walls of Winterfell. They race away from the castle, but they are soon pursued by Bolton men. Theon defends Rickon the best he can, but is soon overwhelmed. Theon is about to be killed when Brienne and Podrick arrive and save them, killing the remaining Bolton men. Brienne, Pod, Theon, and Rickon then make their way away from Winterfell. Now, as you viewers know, we are keeping in Brienne axing Stannis following the battle on the ice. I do like this as it does wrap up the plot thread of Brienne wanting revenge for Renly's death. The only thing that bugged me was that in the show, Brienne abandons her mission to save Sansa at Winterfell to confront Stannis. As I said, I think this was pretty out of character. But if we switch Brienne's decision to go after Stannis till after she knows that Rickon is safe, I think this plays a bit better. After making their way away from Winterfell, and knowing Rickon is safe with Pod and Theon, then I could see Brienne, driven by her desire for revenge against Stannis, to leave Rickon with Pod and Theon to go after him. As in the show, our rewrite will find Stannis injured after his loss at the Battle of the Ice, and as he sits there waiting for his death, Brienne approaches him, ready to enact her revenge. But that is when Stannis asks Brienne to look after his daughter Shireen at Castle Black. Brienne, having built Stannis up as this horrid monster ever since the day Renly died, is given pause, not expecting to see this evil man express such care and love for anyone. Brienne then raises her sword and kills Stannis. Brienne meets back up with Theon, Pod, and Rickon, and and they make their way to Castle Black, which ends Season 5. Season 6 picks up with them still on their way, but just on the outskirts of Castle Black, Theon decides to travel back to the Iron Islands as he does in the show. Brienne, Pod, and Rickon arrive at Castle Black just around the time Sansa arrives, and thus we see the reunion of 3 of the Starks. Season 6 will see Brienne, as she does in the show, hanging around Castle Black and helping Sansa and Jon with their preparation for the Battle of the Bastards. As they know, Ramsay and Roose will absolutely come after Rickon as he threatens their hold over the north. Now, while she will be hanging around for the majority of the season, given her conversation with Stannis just before his death, we will see Brienne dealing with her now changed perspective on the man that Stannis was. Upon learning that Stannis sacrificed himself to allow his men to return to Castle Black, her constitution is rocked. I would love to see a few scenes between her and Shireen, with Shireen speaking of her father in such high and loving regard. And I think this goes well with Martin's general view of revenge. In the books, we see several characters become consumed with revenge, and even when that revenge could be said to be justified, it is always a double-edged sword. Even when Tyrion takes his revenge on his father Tywin, which may be the most satisfying act of vengeance up until that point in the show, when we pick up with him in A Dance with Dragons, he is a miserable mess who has fallen into a pit of self-hatred and disgust. While he may not necessarily feel remorseful for killing his father, it clearly has brought him no peace. In our rewrite, Brienne will have to reckon with the fact that she executed a man who had just laid down his life for his comrades and family. While you could argue Stannis still deserves to die due to him executing Renly, Brienne most likely would still feel conflicted over killing a man who was loved and respected by so many, who, like her, was once deemed an outsider who slowly earned respect through his strong sense of duty. I think this will be a fascinating theme to explore through Brienne. Brienne's dedication to honor and duty is what defines her character, so it would be compelling to have her realize that perhaps sticking to that honor in all circumstances, no matter what, well, maybe it isn't always the best or most moral option. Had Brienne known what Stannis had done for his men at this moment, would she have still executed him? Would she have weighted his sacrifice in her view of whether or not he deserved death, or would she have carried out her duty regardless? I think the show sort of leaned into revenge as more of a straight-up cathartic act, especially in the second half of the series. We went over in depth in Arya's video how this sort of straight-up fuck yeah view of revenge flies in the face of the point of other characters' arcs. That isn't to say that it can't be used. In our last video, the Blackfish killing Roose is pretty much straight-up cathartic, but then again, these two aren't exactly major POV characters in the grand scheme of the show. Our rewrite has done what it can to try and keep in this backhanded effective revenge. When Arya kills Walder Frey and the rest, it is of course incredibly cathartic, but our rewrite made a point to note that, while it's nice to see these fuckers get theirs, we are simultaneously worried that Arya is starting to go a bit cuckoo banana pancakes, and this may prevent her from returning to her family the same Arya they know and love. In the book, revenge is always treated as a double-edged sword. Not so much in the show. In the show, Brienne killing Stannis is cathartic, sure, but there is no real examination of it afterwards. I know I've mentioned this before, but I actually think the writers had at one point considered having Brienne not killing Stannis and perhaps bringing him back to Castle Black to answer for the death of Shireen. This is why I think they didn't show Stannis' death on screen. Yes, there are examples in other media of characters dying off screen, and yet there is no ambiguity as to their fate. But I don't see why they wouldn't have just shown Stannis die here, especially since he was clearly built up as a straight up villain in the show. I honestly think they left this open to see if they could work him in somehow in season 6, but then they were like, nah, and tossed in a throwaway line to make sure we knew he was gone. Anyway, back on track. So throughout season 6, we will see Brienne grapple with her killing of Stannis, and see her relationship with Shireen grow, but mainly we will see her work with Sansa and Jon to prepare for the Battle of the Bastards. Now in the show, Sansa sends Brienne to see if she can recruit the Blackfish to their cause. I already discussed how silly and pointless this plot thread ends up being, and how it doesn't really make any sense, but per our last episode, where we switched Jaime's season 5 and 6 plotlines, by this time, Riverrun has already been taken by the Lannisters, and the Blackfish has already traveled to the north and has begun his guerrilla operation against the Boltons at Winterfell. So what are we going to do with Brienne? For fuck's sake, just keep her at Castle Black so her and Pod can kick some ass at the Battle of the Bastards. Frankly, this is what they should have done in the show, even when Jaime's season 6 arc was still him dealing with the siege of Riverrun. Sending Brienne to Riverrun results in nothing. The only thing it does is give Brienne and Jaime a nice scene together, but it really isn't worth the gaps in logic on Sansa's part of thinking the Blackfish could possibly aid them in the Battle of the Bastards, and not watching Brienne and Pod slay some Bolton scum. So our rewrite will see Brienne and Pod remain at Castle Black and be there for the Battle of the Bastards. Season 7, while it does see Brienne mostly just waiting around until she is sent to KL by Sansa, unfortunately I can't see us adding that much for Brienne to do. The events at Winterfell, both in the book and in our rewrite, are more focused around Littlefinger trying to pit Arya against Sansa, and Sansa's attempts to take Littlefinger out, which he ultimately succeeds at. And given the shortened Season 7, there isn't that much time for Brienne to have any big plot thread or seasonal arc. So we'll basically just keep her arc intact. There are some nice moments she shares with Pod and Arya, so it's not all pointless. And as for her being sent by Sansa to the KL, rather than how in the show this is used to sort of dupe the audience into thinking that Sansa is plotting to axe Arya, which we have discussed was pretty stupid, Sansa sending Brienne away will serve as a move by her to try and disarm Littlefinger, since on our rewrite, we as an audience know at this point that Sansa knows Littlefinger is trying to manipulate her and is leading him into a trap. So Brienne travels to KL like she does in Season 7 and returns to Winterfell for the beginning of Season 8. Despite the overall clusterfuck it devolved into, the first 2 episodes of Season 8 have plenty of golden moments, and perhaps the highlight of the first 2 episodes, and perhaps even the entire season, is of course Jaime knighting Brienne, a culmination 5 seasons in the making that serves as a beautiful cap to Brienne's journey. How her resilience and dedication to honor and justice inspired one of the most reviled characters of the series to learn from his past mistakes and develop into one of the most beloved characters of the show. To see someone who was cast out by others due to her looks, her gender, to see her surrounded by fellow characters who respect and care for her as she is given the one thing she has always wanted, it's one of the best moments of the series. And in terms of Brienne's character, well, things didn't get totally fucked in episode 3. Though the long night was the beginning of the horrible, horrible end, Brienne's character was left intact as she cut through the army of the dead with Jaime by her side. Sure, it was a little unrealistic that they both survived this onslaught, but it's nothing to get too cray-cray about. But then there's episode 4. Let me correct myself. The long night may not have been the beginning of the end. It was the viewer's first indication that things weren't going to go so well due to the writer's flippant disregard for the conclusion to the most overarching plot thread of the entire series. But there was still hope that maybe they had something up their sleeve. That just maybe they could pull it off. And episode 4 is when everything fell apart. We saw characters make ridiculously contrived decisions, more contrived decisions, more contrived decisions, more contrived decisions. We saw absolutely absurd and unbelievable, not in a good way, plot turns, egregious Dunkin' Donuts product placement, though some of it was pretty obscure, not sure if you caught it or not. Yeah, this was the one where the creeping feeling you had in episode 3 crawled its way into your heart and stabbed it with an ice pick. But perhaps the most insulting, ridiculous, horrific moment of what may be the worst episode of the entire series is, of course,
You're a virgin.
Fucking what the fucking fuck? Who the fuck? Fuck this fucking. How did you do fucking fucks? Fuck!
God damn it. What is the purpose of this? Why would Tyrion do this? He never came off as someone who is akin to a high school bully who would tease someone for not getting laid. Why is this anything at all? Why does this scene exist? To have Brienne's character arc, which was all about her honor and dedication to duty and her resilience and bravery, to have it capped off by this? Jesus fuck, what a slap in the face to such an amazing character. And oh boy, it doesn't end there. This just so happens to be the moment that Jaime decides to go and speak with her, and their romantic dynamic finally comes to fruition. Okay, so let's discuss this. Now, one thing many mention regarding Jaime's episode is how I mentioned that I never saw Jaime and Brienne's relationship as a romantic one, but more as one of mutual respect and honor. Many pointed out that in the books, the romantic dynamic between Jaime and Brienne is palpable and telegraphed pretty damn hard, and I agree. However, I don't believe this is communicated nearly as well in the show as it is in the book. Again, as we have discussed before, when moving from medium to medium, you need to compensate for the lack of ability to delve into the private thoughts of your characters. In the books, after Brienne and Jaime split up at the end of A Storm of Swords, we do not have the benefit of seeing their great chemistry play out. We are simply restricted to their inner monologues, and via these monologues, we can sense a mutual pining for each other throughout A Feast for Crows. And herein lies the issue. In the show, after Brienne and Jaime part in in Season 4, the romantic dynamic really isn't addressed until Season 8. Yes, they do share a couple scenes together between Seasons 4 and 8, and by a couple, I literally mean a couple, literally 2 scenes, neither of which really contain any romantic or sexual tension. But since in the show, Jaime's relationship with Cersei remains intact pretty much all the way up until the end of Season 7, there isn't much room or opportunity to find ways to show the feelings Jaime is catching for Brienne. Whereas in the book, Jaime basically severs his relationship with Cersei within the span of a single book, with him rejecting her plea to return to King's Landing after her Walk of Atonement. Also, Jaime and Brienne don't spend nearly as much time apart in the books as they do in the show. In the books, after the Siege of Riverrun, Brienne comes to him and brings him the Lay Stoneheart. Now, while Jaime sells the Siege of Riverrun at the end of A Feast for Crows, Book 4, and Brienne comes to him at the end of A Dance with Dragons, Book 5, for those of you familiar with the books, you know that these 2 books don't necessarily occur in chronological order, with each book more or less being restricted to one of 2 sets of characters. I'd argue it is easier to consider these 2 books as basically just one big-ass book, and therefore, the time that passes between Jaime and Brienne separating at the end of A Storm of Swords and them reuniting at the end of A Dance with Dragons is probably, based on other events in the books, maybe less than a year, somewhere around there. So not only do Jaime and Brienne spend less time apart, and moving forward they are probably going to be spending a lot of time together throughout the Winds of Winter, but during that time we see their pining for one another via their inner monologues. But in the show, not only do they spend much more time apart, we don't have the benefit of seeing their romantic feelings being expressed through their thoughts. And Jaime and Cersei's relationship doesn't fall apart until late in Season 7, so it seems like Jaime is still hung up on her throughout the vast majority of the series. So when I said I didn't see Jaime and Brienne as a romance plot, I meant more so in the show than in the book. In the book, it is very clear and built up well, whereas in the show, I feel like it gets dropped and then gets picked up in Season 8 more for fan service rather than a culmination of a slowly growing relationship. But I digress. We can still keep in the romance between Jaime and Brienne. I don't think it is built up nearly as well in the show as it is in the book, but it's nice, so it's cool. However, my problem with Brienne and Jaime banging isn't about them actually banging, but the fact that it happens right after the god-awful scene where we learn Brienne is a virgin. Therefore, when Jaime runs off and bangs her immediately after this, it almost comes off as like, hey, you're a virgin?
I can fix that.
Maybe the writers wanted to highlight that Brienne's bone session with Jaime was her first time, and thus it makes it more special. Not sure if I agree with that, but why not have Brienne just disclose this to Jaime right before they fuck? Why humiliate her in such a shit way a scene earlier? God, this part sucks. They could have just had Jaime and Brienne make love on their own accord. 2 people who have grown a deep and mutual respect for each other, which includes romantic feelings, who have just survived perhaps the most horrifying experience of their lives, and having been so close to death makes them realize they shouldn't hold back their feelings anymore, and they consummate. But no, there's this weird, creepy dynamic with them making a whole deal about Brienne being a virgin, and the fact that Jaime and Brienne fuck immediately after this, it just casts a perverted shadow over it. If Brienne wasn't a virgin, and we cut out the drinking game scene, would it make Jaime and Brienne's love scene in any way less than? Absolutely not. We will keep in the love scene, but for fuck's sake we are taking out the drinking game scene right before it. Have them just talk after the battle, their previous unspoken and unexpressed feelings for one another now coming to the surface due to their inhibitions being lifted from their brush with certain death, which ends with them making love. Okay? Good. I don't ever want to think about this godforsaken scene ever fucking again. Thanks, goodbye. And then there is, of course, the scene where Jaime leaves Brienne to return to Cersei. So we've already gone over how stupid, contrived, and out of character this was for Jaime, but now let's talk about Brienne's reaction to it. Look, I'm not going to be the person who is like having Brienne break down crying during the scene is bad because it's sexist. Her gender really has nothing to do with why this is weird. The reason Brienne's reaction seems so weird is simply due to the ridiculous nature of Jaime's choice. Like, why all of a sudden is Jaime now deciding that he is a piece of shit? After he repented for his past ways, after he saved Brienne on multiple occasions, after he sailed the siege of Riverrun peacefully against the wishes of Cersei, after he abandoned her in order to fight for humanity in the home of the people he did so much wrong to. It is so fucking dumb, and the fact that Brienne doesn't seem to point this out makes it twice as dumb. Like, why isn't Brienne telling him of all the good things he has done that disprove what he thinks about himself? Brienne should be just as confused and frustrated as us viewers were during this scene, and she just lets him go. She should be calling him a fucking moron and dragging his sexy ass back to bed and pinning him down till the Battle of King's Landing is over. But for our rewrite, it's a moot point. because per Jaime's episode, instead of him leaving to die with Cersei, Jaime is forced to go to King's Landing by Dany in order to try and make a last-ditch effort to convince Cersei to surrender. This obviously doesn't work. Jaime is told by Tyrion that Cersei is pregnant. Jaime races to the Red Keep to save her. Arya arrives and saves their newborn daughter, and Jaime, having been mortally wounded by Gregor, dies by his sister's side. Not because he is still hung up on her, but because, as the man of honor he is, it was the right thing to do, to never give up on his family, no matter how far they may have fallen. And though Brienne is upset about losing Jaime, at least in this scenario, Jaime's reason for dying makes sense and is in line with his development as a character, as opposed to the writers just wanting it to happen and contriving it so. So in episode 4, our rewrite will see Brienne and Jaime sharing a tearful goodbye at Winterfell before Jaime departs for King's Landing. He promises he will come back to her, but unfortunately, as we know, this does not come to pass. However, following the Battle of King's Landing and Arya rescuing baby Joanna, per Arya's episode, Brienne will be let in on the child's true identity, and that her job as protector of both Sansa and Arya Stark will also be to be the sworn protector of Jaime's daughter. And thus, Brienne's arc ends with her traveling back to Winterfell to serve as the head of Sansa's guard, where she serves alongside Arya. And so, Brienne of Tarth, who began our series as an outcast, someone who was told she would never be the knight she dreamed of being, but by remaining true and sticking to her guns, won the respect and admiration of some of the most prominent figures in the land, and even was the catalyst of having a man who was so far gone into thinking that he could never be honorable, believing in himself and become something better. Ends with the series as the protector of the children, Sansa, Arya, and baby Joanna, of the two people whom she admired the most. A fitting end to a hell of a character. And that will end this episode of Game of Thrones Rewrite. Again, mostly just sort of recapping Brienne's arc and having it match up with our changes made thus far, but I think we add a few cool tidbits and tied up some of the more controversial and frustrating beats of Brienne's arc. Now, as to where we go from here, the last 3 episodes have pretty much discussed, mainly, the happenings in the north throughout seasons 5 and 6. But now we are heading across the narrow sea, where we will focus more on the happenings of the characters who don't have as much of a large role in the War of the Five Kings. And to begin this saga, next episode we will discuss my man Varys. A lot of you have been waiting for this one, and we are going to go in depth into the multiple theories as to the role he has played in the events thus far, and what grand scheme he may be planning for the future, and how a lot of that got scrapped and forgotten in the show, and the reaction many had to the conclusion of his arc was, well, this clip speaks for itself. Make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, consider supporting the channel on Patreon, and I'll see you next time.